2021 was the year for setting targets. Is 2022 going to be the year when banks' net zero transition plans really turn into actions? It's been said that a goal without a plan is just a wish. Well, a plan without actions isn't a plan, it's just a speech. This issue is going to be particularly important in the light of the recent announcements from GFANZ and the Race to Zero. I'm James Vaccaro. I'm Executive Director for the Climate Safe Lending Network. I'm also in the advisory panel for GFANZ, the Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero, which is bringing together all the financial institutions who've set net zero targets. Climate Safe Lending Network and our stakeholders spent a lot of time bringing together the views within banks and investors, think tanks, NGOs, academia, regulators last year to look at what constitutes a good transition plan. And the good transition plan has definitely fed into what we've seen coming out this week from GFANZ, publishing what they see as necessary within financial institutions' net zero transition plans. And there's a lot of great stuff within what came out. In particular, there's focus on actionable strategies with near-term actions. It's not just about hitting things in 2050, it's about the here and now. What can be implemented in terms of clear policies, products which are going to add value and catalyse change, engagement strategies with clients. It's looking at some of the broader forces of influence, things which we described as well, like lobbying and public policy advocacy. It's certainly true that governments are going to need to align their policy, but banks can be powerful, influential actors in positively promoting that. And it's asking questions about organisational changes required for successful net zero planning, like incentives, training, and the cultural changes. The questions that raised, though, when you actually go through all this documents, and there's about 90,000 words being published this month by GFANZ, that's the size of a PhD thesis. What does it really want to know? What is it that banks have to do, and has that really changed? What we do know is that there's going to be a question needing to be addressed this year on where the red line is going to be drawn. That seems to be the looming question, which is not yet fully addressed as specifically or as explicitly as people want it to be. In particular, the critical concern is around the continued investment in an expansion or exploration of new fossil fuels and deforestation. Now, this issue can sometimes be conflated with stopping all production or divesting completely from the sector. That's different. What we're talking is about continuation of the investment into the expansion of fossil fuels or the continued deforestation, which, if we continue in that path, the economy becomes so entangled with these assets or the loss of these natural assets that it's very hard to avoid significant harm, either in the form of economic pain through stranded assets or through the huge, immense physical risk of climate change if we blow through the budget, carbon budget of 1.5 degrees to keep us within safe levels. The carbon budget that we have left, and given that we're a quarter way through this decisive decade on the way to 2030, is around about 300 to 400 gigatons. Depends on the probability that you choose and you're comfortable with being able to hit that target. Now, according to Carbon Tracker's data, there's about 3,700 gigatons just within the fossil fuels companies of potential reserves. So if that gets invested in terms of crystallising expanded capacity, then we're blowing through those carbon budgets around about 10 times. So that seems to suggest that, well, it's very obvious that we can't continue this expansion investment in the infrastructure of fossil fuels and expect reasonably to stay within the bounds of 1.5 degrees. It would be pouring fuel on the fire. Now, GFANZ is the Financial Sector Leadership Initiative, but it isn't necessarily the enforcer, it isn't the scrutiny body for these targets and transition plans being met. So who's responsible for accountability? Well, GFANZ is part of the Race to Zero. Race to Zero is governed by the UN. It's the largest global alliance of real economy actors and 120 countries committed to achieving net zero by 2050 at the latest. And it's Race to Zero who this month also announced that their guideline updates and specifically called out red lines, which all of the different alliances, financial alliances, are going to have to uphold. And they said there is a need for the accelerated phase out of fossil fuels. We're very explicit about no new coal investments, and by extension the implication clearly is no room for oil and gas, any fossil fuel expansion, nor any deforestation. Now, does this really represent a change or a clarification? When we published the Good Transition Plan last year, we said, well, it really needed to be clarified because we saw that this was a direct implication, and it's certainly something which is going to need absolute clarity later on this year. But what happens if these tighter rules means that the coalitions don't reach the remaining half of the financial system that haven't signed up? What if the current actors who are there suddenly say, well, this clarification makes it problematic for us to keep going and keep our commitments? Likewise, what happens if these rules aren't science-based and the actions don't really reflect the changes needed? Those are the key dilemmas which are going to be framing the big challenges in 2022. The other actors in this are not just Race to Zero in terms of enforcement, but it's the regulators perhaps, and regulators are increasingly looking at climate risk. The European Central Bank said this month that capital requirements might need to be enforced based upon the climate risk of banks. The transition plans are going to become mandatory in the UK. Climate Safe Lending Network also sits on the transition plan task force of the Treasury. But it's also science. Science is not going to wait for the feasibility of institutions in order to be able to say what is going to keep the world to within safe limits. And at a certain point that can become a very powerful forcing function. And ultimately for society, at what point do we reach the tipping point of the license to operate for banks and financial institutions to continue with these practices which are not aligned? Climate Safe Lending Network, as our role as conveners in this space, are going to be continually focused on these questions. We want to explore with the network what's helpful from what's come out this month, what's frustrating or going to be challenging for institutions, what is frustrating in terms of not being clear enough still and needing to be much more explicit. Are there some hidden gems or opportunities, some pathway through this where we can see opportunities for systemic change? There's consultations everywhere you look at the moment. Everybody seems to be asked their opinion. Climate Safe Lending Network exists to help all sides listen a little bit better, to hear one another and to find some new pathway through the change we need, often bringing together actors who don't consult with each other in that direct way. And we need to find ways of being able to strengthen these frameworks and protocols together and to get more banks in, to get them more comfortable with wanting to make these major changes. We'll speak more on this in the future. We really hope to hear from you. And for now, thanks a lot and have a good month.